The aurora lights danced across the Arctic sky in waves of green and violet, and Captain Sarah Chen thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen at 35,000 feet. But then the lights changed direction, moved against the wind, and began flowing directly toward her aircraft like something alive and hunting. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. And please like and subscribe for more videos like this. Sarah had been flying commercial jets for 12 years. She had logged over 8,000 hours in the cockpit, flown through storms that shook the plane like a toy, navigated equipment failures, and landed safely in conditions that would terrify most people. She was calm under pressure, methodical, and never let fear cloud her judgment. Tonight was supposed to be routine. Flight 2847 from Anchorage to Reykjavik. A red-eye crossing over the Arctic Circle with 143 passengers asleep in their seats and a crew she trusted completely. Her co-pilot, James Rodriguez, sat beside her, running through standard checks. The flight attendants had just finished the final service. The cabin was dark except for a few reading lights. Sarah glanced out the cockpit window and saw them. The aurora borealis. She had seen them dozens of times before, but tonight they seemed especially vivid. Curtains of emerald light rippled across the black sky, shifting and swaying like silk in an invisible breeze. Beautiful night for it, James said, leaning forward to get a better view. Sarah nodded. Never gets old. They flew on in comfortable silence. The instruments showed everything normal. Airspeed steady. Altitude locked. Fuel consumption exactly where it should be. The plane hummed beneath them, a familiar sound that Sarah found almost soothing. She checked the weather radar. Clear skies for the next 200 miles. Perfect conditions. Then something changed. Sarah noticed it first in her peripheral vision. The aurora lights, which had been flowing eastward with the high-altitude winds, suddenly shifted. The green ribbons seemed to curl back on themselves, twisting in a way that did not match any natural pattern she had ever seen. She blinked, thinking her eyes were tired. But when she looked again, the movement was unmistakable. James, are you seeing this? He leaned closer to the window. The lights were no longer dancing randomly. They were moving with purpose, forming shapes that almost looked geometric. Hexagons and spirals, pulsing in rhythm. That is not normal, James said quietly. Sarah had heard stories from other pilots. Strange things seen in the Arctic skies. Lights that moved in unusual ways. Instruments that went haywire for no apparent reason. She had always chalked it up to exhaustion, optical illusions, or overactive imaginations. But now, watching the aurora bend and flow toward them, she felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The lights moved closer. What had been miles away now seemed to be just beyond the nose of the aircraft. Sarah checked the instruments again. Everything still read normal, but her instincts, honed by thousands of hours in the air, were screaming that something was wrong. Then the radio crackled. The voice that came through was distorted, breaking up with static, but Sarah could make out fragments. Flight 2847, this is Reykjavik Control. Do you copy? Sarah reached for the radio. Reykjavik Control, this is Flight 2847. We copy. Go ahead. More static. Then silence. Sarah tried again. Reykjavik Control, please repeat your last transmission. Nothing. Just the hiss of dead air. James checked the radio equipment. The dials and switches all looked fine. He tried switching frequencies. Still nothing. They had lost all communication. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but kept her voice steady. Check the backup systems. James worked quickly, flipping switches and checking connections. The backup radio was also silent. They were flying over one of the most remote regions on Earth, and they had just lost all contact with ground control. Then the lights touched the plane. At first, Sarah thought it was just the glow reflecting off the windscreen. But then she realized the green luminescence was wrapping around the fuselage, flowing over the wings like liquid fire. The cockpit filled with an eerie emerald glow. Shadows danced across the instruments. And then the instruments started to fail. The altimeter began spinning wildly. The compass needles swung in circles. The navigation screens flickered and went dark. Sarah grabbed the controls, feeling the plane shudder beneath her hands. They were flying blind. James, talk to me. What are we dealing with? He was scanning every gauge, every readout, his training keeping him focused despite the fear Sarah could see in his eyes. I have got nothing. GPS is down. Navigation is down. We are losing systems across the board. Sarah made a decision. She would fly manually. She had done it before in training simulations, relying on her instruments and her sense of the aircraft. But those simulations had not included mysterious lights that defied physics and wrapped around the plane like tentacles. The aurora grew brighter. The green light intensified until Sarah had to squint. She could feel a strange vibration through the controls, a humming that seemed to resonate in her bones. The plane began to drift, pushed by forces that should not exist at this altitude. We are losing altitude, James said, his voice tight. Sarah pulled back on the controls, but the plane did not respond the way it should. It felt sluggish, as if something was holding it down. She increased throttle. The engines roared, but they were still descending. 200 feet, 300 feet. The altimeter, when it flickered back to life for brief seconds, showed them dropping faster than should be possible without stalling. In the cabin behind them, passengers were waking up. Sarah could hear the flight attendants trying to keep everyone calm, but panic was spreading. People were pointing out the windows at the lights, at the way the aurora seemed to have formed a dome around the entire aircraft. A glowing prison that moved with them no matter which direction Sarah turned. She tried every trick she knew, banking left, then right, increasing speed, decreasing speed. Nothing changed the fact that they were caught in something beyond her understanding. The lights pulsed in rhythm now, a heartbeat that seemed to sync with her own racing pulse. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The lights released them. The aurora scattered back into normal patterns, flowing away from the plane and dispersing across the sky. The instruments blinked back to life, one by one. Navigation online, altimeter stabilizing, radio crackling with voices from ground control asking if they were okay, asking what had happened, asking why they had disappeared from radar for 8 minutes. Sarah checked her watch. From her perspective, they had been caught in that phenomenon for at least 20 minutes. Time itself had gone strange. She steadied the plane, brought them back to proper altitude, and responded to ground control with as much calm as she could manage. Flight 2847 reporting. We experienced a systems malfunction but are now stable and continuing to destination. The rest of the flight passed without incident. Sarah landed the plane in Reykjavik just as dawn broke over the horizon. Her hands were steady on the controls, but inside she was shaking. When the plane finally stopped at the gate and the engines powered down. She sat in silence for a long moment, the passengers, most of them chattering excitedly about the amazing aurora display they had witnessed, about how the lights had seemed to dance right around the plane, about how it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen. They had no idea how close they had come to something unexplainable, something potentially catastrophic. Sarah and James were required to file a report. They sat in a small office at the airport, facing investigators who listened to their account with skepticism barely hidden behind professional courtesy. Other crew members were interviewed separately. The flight attendants confirmed the passengers had seen the lights. The instruments had malfunctioned. The radio had gone silent. But when investigators checked the flight data recorder, they found anomalies that could not be easily explained. Gaps in the data, timestamps that did not align, altitude readings that contradicted radar tracking from the ground. The official report called it an equipment malfunction, combined with unusual atmospheric conditions. Solar flare activity had been high that night. Magnetic interference could explain some of the instrument failures. The aurora borealis, while beautiful, was essentially a radiation storm in the upper atmosphere. Sometimes planes flew through pockets of intense electromagnetic activity that disrupted systems temporarily. But Sarah knew what she had seen. Those lights had moved with intention. They had surrounded the plane deliberately. They had held them in a grip that defied natural laws. And she was not the only one who knew it. In the weeks that followed, Sarah heard from other pilots. Quiet conversations in airport lounges, messages through professional networks. Others had experienced similar events, lights that behaved impossibly, systems that failed in ways that made no sense, time distortions. But everyone stayed silent publicly because speaking up meant being grounded for psychological evaluation. It meant being labeled unstable. It meant the end of a career. Sarah struggled with what to do. She could stay quiet, keep flying, pretend that night had been nothing more than a strange malfunction. Or she could speak up, risk everything, and demand real investigation into what was happening in the Arctic skies. She thought about the 143 people who had been on her plane that night. She thought about the families waiting for them at home. She thought about all the other flights that crossed the Arctic every day. Pilots and passengers who might encounter something they could not understand or control. 3 months after the incident, Sarah submitted a detailed report to the Aviation Safety Board. She included every observation, every instrument reading, every strange detail. She contacted researchers who studied atmospheric phenomena. She reached out to scientists who worked with electromagnetic fields. She refused to let the incident be buried under vague explanations and bureaucratic dismissal. Some people called her obsessed. Others suggested she needed time off. But Sarah also found allies. Physicists who were fascinated by her data. Other pilots who finally felt brave enough to share their own experiences. Engineers who wanted to develop better shielding for aircraft. Electronics. The investigation she pushed for eventually led to new protocols for Arctic flights, better monitoring of solar activity, improved electromagnetic shielding for critical instruments, emergency procedures for pilots who encounter unexplained phenomena. It was not everything Sarah had hoped for, but it was progress. James stayed her friend through all of it. He testified alongside her, backed up her account, refused to let her stand alone. The bond they had formed that night in the cockpit, flying through something impossible, was unbreakable. Sarah still flies. She still crosses the Arctic on clear nights when the aurora dances across the sky. But now she watches those lights with respect and caution. She knows that the universe holds mysteries that humans have barely begun to understand. She knows that sometimes the most beautiful things can also be the most dangerous. And she knows that speaking the truth, even when it costs you, even when people doubt you, is the only way to keep others safe. Because the next pilot who encounters those lights deserves to know what might happen. The next crew deserves preparation. The next passengers deserve a captain who will not stay silent just to protect her career. The Aurora still looks beautiful from 35,000 feet. But Sarah Chen will never again assume that beauty is harmless. She learned that some phenomena demand respect, investigation, and honest acknowledgement, even when we cannot fully explain them. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe for more videos like this.